Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those of you not joining us here on the West Coast. My name is Jennifer Bennett. I'm the Senior Manager of Education and Training here at Volunteer Match. I want to welcome you to our Insight series on advocacy and service-focused nonprofits, challenges, and opportunities. We've got a great panel today and some good, hopefully some good conversation queued up. But before we jump into that, I did just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. First of all of you are on an automatic mute this morning, so you don't need to worry about any background noise on your part. Just because we can't hear your voice doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. You should see a GoToWebinar toolbar in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You can open that up. You should see the word questions with either a plus sign or an arrow sign next to it. That's your questions tool. Please feel free to type in your questions as we're going through today. We'll be certainly having a conversation at the end. If there's something that's specifically related to something that one of our panelists talked about, I'll do my best to try to get that cleared up before we move on. I am going to be live tweeting today, so if you're on Twitter and would like to ask a question there or join in the conversation, you can do so using the hashtag VMLearn, like Volunteer Match Learn. All right. So let's go ahead and introduce today's panelists. First we have Minerva Delgado. Good morning, Minerva.
Good morning, afternoon here in DC. I'm very excited to be with everyone.
Do you want to just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do for the Alliance to End Hunger?
Sure. I'm the Director of Coalitions and Advocacy, and at the Alliance to End Hunger, we engage diverse institutions to work together to end hunger both at home and abroad. And so part of my work is encouraging advocacy among our various members and partners, as well as helping to coordinate some of our domestic coalition work.
Great. Also joining us this morning is Meredith Dodson. Good morning, Meredith.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. I'm so glad to be on the call.
Great. Well, we're glad to have you. You want to tell us a little bit about what you do and what your organization does?
Sure. So Results is a movement of passionate, everyday, committed people. We have a network of volunteers across the country, and they use their voices to influence political decisions that will bring an end to poverty. And I'm based in Washington, D.C. on staff as the director of our U.S. poverty campaigns.
Great. Also joining us, last but not least, certainly is Isaiah Castilla. Good morning, Isaiah.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well. We're glad to have you here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do and what the Alliance for Justice does this morning?
Sure. I'm counsel with Alliance for Justice in our Bolder Advocacy program. Alliance for Justice's Bolder Advocacy program works to improve and strengthen the nonprofit capacity of organizations across the country. And we do that mainly through myself and our team of attorneys helping organizations understand the legal rules that impact their advocacy.
Well,
so we offer.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I know we're lucky to have you here today because I know that's probably going to be one of the biggest questions, but I'm a 501c3, how can I do this? So I'm sure everybody's really looking forward to hearing from you today. All right, so we have a little bit of an agenda. We're going to talk, our panelists are going to talk, do a little presentation for about 20-30 minutes this morning, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. So do start thinking about maybe what you're doing or what you'd like to do with advocacy, what questions you have for our esteemed panelists, and ways that your organization might be able to move the needle. So one of the things we're going to be talking about today is it's really important, of course, to go out there and make sure that people are fed or have access to health care, but that sort of just chasing down that flood, that river, advocacy is a way to really sort of change some of those underlying problems. All right. We do have a couple polls. We'd like to get to know you a little bit before I turn it over to our panelists. Our first question is asking you what kind of organization do you work for? If you want to just take a minute there and vote for or select which type of organization that best describes what you're doing now in your work. All right, we'll give people just another couple of seconds here. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share that, and it looks like overwhelmingly we have people in that 501c3 tax-exempt categories and a few others in there. Nobody here working in the for-profit world, and a few people who are currently just not sure or not working with an organization currently. All right. So the other question we have is if you're doing any type of advocacy work now, if your organization has done advocacy work in the past, you haven't done it, or if you're just not sure. So go ahead again and we'll just vote a little bit. All right, get your last votes in if you haven't had a chance to vote yet, and we'll go ahead and share that. So again, looks like there's a lot of people out there doing this already, so let's get some information out there, get some conversation going about what's working and what's not working, maybe some new ideas, and some people who are just getting started, so it's an opportunity maybe to learn some more. All right. So I'm going to go ahead. Oops. Here we go. Somehow I've gotten into play mode. Let's go back. There we go. I'm going to turn this over to Isaiah, and if you just want to let me know when you're ready to move to the next slide, I'll go ahead and do that.
Okay, great. Well, you can go ahead and move to the next slide, and we can jump right in with this question: what is advocacy? Often we find with groups, with organizations that we work with, that there's, this conflation, I guess is the right way to put it, of advocacy with lobbying. Now, lobbying is a form of advocacy, but it's not the only form of advocacy. There are many things that you can do as a nonprofit, as a 501c3 public charity to advocate that aren't lobbying. Now, let me be clear. As a 501c3 public charity, you can lobby. We'll talk about that later. Oftentimes people will tell you that, oh, you're a C3, you can't lobby, and that, in fact, is not true. You can lobby to a limited extent, and as I said, we'll talk about that later. Could you move to the next slide, please? Next slide.
Sure, just a second. I'm not sure. There we go. What's going on?
Okay. So advocacy comes in many forms. Of course, this is, marching or rallying is a form of advocacy, a great way to show support of a cause or an issue and show strength and build confidence in your constituents. Next slide. Meeting with legislators. So, often, meeting with a legislator isn't lobbying, right? Sometimes it's education or just getting to know your legislator so they learn to trust you. That's a part of advocacy. Next slide. And of course, legislative priorities or legislation, finding where you can be active as a 501c3 public charity on your issues and with your constituents. Next slide. Lobbying. Here we have lobbying online and in the digital space, and this is a great way to not only to lobby, but to lobby cheaply on a budget, right? If you can only do a limited amount of lobbying and your grassroots lobbying is limited, a great way to do that that's low cost is through Twitter or Facebook or any other social media platform. Then next slide. And so finally, here's a slide that shows you, all our avenues of advocacy. And since the majority of folks who are on the phone today are or on the webinar today are 501c3 public charities. You see I've got partisan political activity in red for the C3. That's completely off limits. There are many things you can do in any election context that are nonpartisan, but partisan political is strictly off limits. Lobbying is in yellow because that's, you know, it comes with some rules and some regulations. So you should slow down there, but everything else is in green, and you should go all out as an organization in engaging in every avenue of advocacy and using all the tools that are in your toolbox to get your word out and to get the message out and advocate on behalf of your constituents.
Great. All right, Minerva, you want to move us into why advocate?
Sure. We can actually move ahead slide-wise. So, you know, Isaiah did a great job of really explaining that advocacy covers a lot of ground in terms of the various activities you can do. And I'll tell you a secret, advocacy is not necessarily a difficult thing to do. What I find is typically a challenge is really making the resolution to do it in the first place is where people kind of get hung up. But since most of you are doing some advocacy today, I think I'm going to go pretty quickly through this so we can get more into the opportunities and challenges. You know, first off, as nonprofits, we know we're dealing with big problems. Typically, we're talking about folks who are low income, maybe dealing with different challenges, and we know that, you know, right now we have 48 million people who are living in food insecure households, another 45 million, of course there's a tremendous amount of overlap here, who are living in poverty. I know these numbers have been updated as of today. I haven't seen them, but I understand that there hasn't been a big decrease here, which is another issue in and of itself. But typically, we're dealing with some of the biggest problems and issues that our society faces as nonprofits. And we know that big problems require big solutions. If you could go to the next slide. When we're talking about, you know, nonprofits who are involved in direct services, I used to, just so you know, I used to run a nonprofit that distributed food. And I know it can be difficult to think about doing advocacy on top of everything else that you're involved with. Most nonprofits that are doing direct services focus on providing resources or services, responding to the immediate needs of their program participants who may need food or shelter, medical assistance, and so forth. And as important as these services are, and we certainly are not downplaying the importance of these vital services, they only address the symptoms or the effects of social problems. So for example, if you're working with the homeless, we know that homelessness is a symptom of large societal issues, including the lack of affordable housing, low wages, lack of comprehensive mental health services in communities. But in terms of their day-to-day work, most nonprofits who are working with the homeless are not addressing these issues, which is why it can be difficult sometimes to just change gears and focus on advocacy as a response to the challenges that you're seeing day to day. But advocacy does focus you on changing structures and systems to really address root causes of issues in the long term, and that's why it's important to really have that focus. So I would like you to think of these activities not as either or, not service versus advocacy, but as complementary activities, since they're both necessary to fully address the issues that many of us are dealing with. Next slide, please. And then I think finally the other response to why advocate is because advocacy works. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about this, but elected officials in particular want to hear from their constituents. After all, they were elected to represent you. This chart from the Congressional Management Foundation, which I've adapted actually from a chart that they have in their report, says that, you know, when they ask congressional staff how influential these tactics here have been in terms of having some or a lot of influence on the member of Congress that is trying to decide on an issue, we see that some of these activities are highly influential. So an in-person visit, for example, at the top, is the most influential, with 97% of people saying it has some or a lot of influence. But not further behind that is contact from a constituent who represents other constituents, so that's at 96%. So as representatives of social service organizations, you have the potential to really influence your member of Congress or your elected officials' ideas on how do we solve some of these big picture problems. Next slide, please.
All right. Isaiah, you want to bring us into sort of some of these opportunities that are out there, getting involved and bringing this back around to our mission?
Sure. So, as Minerva so eloquently laid out, part of justice and kind of alleviating, a lot of it. So the need for direct service comes from some issues that need to be dealt with on a systemic level. So we need systemic change to address some of the root causes of poverty or hunger. There are reasons why we need the direct service, and we have to address that root cause. One of the ways to do that is to use grassroots lobbying or direct lobbying, and we'll talk about the definition of direct lobbying. But first, let's kind of talk about grassroots, because that's about getting to the community and getting to people who want to speak out and communicate with the general public about issues. And so the IRS for 501c3s defines grassroots lobbying as a communication to the general public that expresses a view about specific legislation through a call to action. Now, this grassroots lobbying is limited. You can do a limited amount, and we'll talk about it later, but the most important thing to remember is that it has to have a call to action in order for it to be considered grassroots lobbying. If it has no call to action, it's not grassroots lobbying, right? It's just an issue ad or maybe a public service announcement. But grassroots lobbying really helps you to address root causes, to stay focused on your mission, to bring about systemic change in a very poignant way. Could you go to the next slide, please? So call to action is defined as telling the general public to contact their legislator. Next click. Providing contact information for legislators, providing a mechanism or a way to contact their legislator, and finally identifying legislators, just simply listing those folks who may be voting on a bill or some legislation that may be out there. So this is a great way to advocate, to directly take advantage of opportunities that you have to reach out to the general public and engage your constituents in systemic change.
Great, thanks Isaiah. Welcome Meredith. I know we haven't heard from you yet, but do you want to talk a little bit about how you can leverage some of that expertise and credibility within your organization within advocacy work?
Yeah, great. So I know Minerva already shared the great visual, which is on the next slide, the data from the Congressional Management Foundation, but I wanted to circle back to that and talk about it a bit more. So many of you are really regarded, whether you like it or not, as leaders in your community, and that includes the way that policymakers think of you and the organizations that you represent and the work that you do. So as Minerva underscored already, these in-person issue visits from constituents is the most effective strategy to influence members of Congress, and I think this is very much also, what works with Congress, I found also very much works with state policymakers, with your city council, etc. But if you look at this data from the Congressional Management Foundation, you can see that 96% of the staff members who work for members of Congress said that contact from a constituent who represents other constituents has a lot of influence, or a lot of influence over their decisions. So what that means is the stories that you can bring, the information about the needs in your community, and the clients that you work with who can tell their own stories, that those are really critical voices, and that you representing that work in the community has a lot of influence over policymakers. And as if you scroll down, if you look down in that thing, only 8% of congressional staff thinks that a visit from a lobbyist has a lot of influence. So as opposed to 36% saying that contact from someone like you at an organization based in the community has influence. So don't think that all the decision making, all the sausage making happens inside DC and that you can't influence the process. You very much can influence the process, and your opinions matter. And that's true in direct communication with them, and also in media work, and other strategies you might use. The one other thing before we get off of this this slide, the one other thing I just want to quickly point out, and this is true for you as individuals and representing your representing your organizations, but also it's true for just generally other folks you might work with in the community. There's been a big shift in the way that we communicate with policymakers, and in particular, unlike 10 or 15 years ago when I first started training volunteers to do advocacy with Congress, you can see that now kind of emails and postal letters are more or less the same in terms of how much influence they have. The difference is whether or not it's individualized, meaning is there kind of information, again, kind of about the needs in the community, who you're serving, local data, why you care about the issue. Those, embedding that in communications that you have with policymakers, again, will make sure that you have a lot more impact in the process. So that's one other thing I wanted to point out while we still had that that slide up. And again, you know, I work with results volunteers who meet all the time with members of Congress, you know, face to face, and also with their staff. And I can say firsthand that when there's folks like many of you who come to those meetings, who can say, you know, here at our food bank, we're seeing the need, you know, the demand go up for the nutrition assistance that we provide, or here at our United Way agency, we have, you know, thousands of low-income working families looking for our help in helping file their taxes, and this is the impact that the earned income tax credit is having in our community. When you can say that, when policymakers listen, and they very much respond. So I just wanted to kind of share that perspective. Minerva, do you want to add to that a bit?
Actually, no, I think you said it all. Thank you so much.
Great.
Great, Minerva, you want to jump in here with
Yes.
some more of those empowering clients and volunteers?
Great. If you can go to the next slide. So, you know, when we talk about the opportunities related to advocacy, I found, you know, I mentioned that I once ran a food distribution organization. Once I pivoted our organization, you know, to go from providing food and also raising awareness about hunger in our community and advocating for solutions to hunger, I found that I opened a whole new set of relationships, partnerships, funding opportunities for my organization. And I didn't need any additional resources to do that. So while I can't promise this is going to happen to you, particularly the funding part of it, I can promise that once you engage in advocacy, you will occupy a different space among the nonprofits in your community. And some of the biggest benefits I found, you know, to my organization were engaging program participants and volunteers in new ways that really re-energized my program and staff members, because people, as Isaiah said, you know, they want to speak out. They want to be part of the solution. And the other thing I found was that, you know, I felt really good about the fact that we were empowering our participants and volunteers to become change agents. in our community. So those are some very important opportunities.
Great. Are you ready to lead us into some of those challenges
Yes,
too?
absolutely. So challenges. When we talk about challenges, let's go to the next slide. So, I often ask myself, if we know advocacy is needed because these problems that we're dealing with are real and significant, and we know that, advocacy is needed to address the root causes of so many of the issues that we deal with, and we know it works, why don't people do more of it? And so I think, the answer comes down to organizational capacity. These are some of the concerns I hear from organizations. If you have other concerns, that are not listed here, please type them in so we can try to address those as well. But I usually hear people are overextended, I don't have time, they're under-resourced, they feel like, I don't have dedicated staff for this, I don't have a budget to do this, or they lack the expertise, not necessarily the expertise of what's happening in their community, but they feel like, maybe I'm not the most political person, or I don't know really where to start. And so those are some of the challenges that I typically have heard. And the truth is people are feeling overwhelmed, and for good reason. But even if you are feeling all these things, there are still lots you can do in terms of advocacy. So as Isaiah said, advocacy covers a lot of ground in terms of what you can do. But, there are things that you can do, even if you're at the starting point. And I know that if you're interested in assessing your organizational capacity to do advocacy, Isaiah's going to tell you a little bit about a great tool in a little while. But for now, how do we address these concerns? Let's go to the next slide. So, so how do we address these organizational capacity concerns? Advocacy is a great volunteer project, so this is one way to think about it. We know, in the hunger arena in particular, there are hundreds of thousands of volunteers who work in organizations, and they really are interested in being part of the solution. And you may have a number of volunteers who are really committed to working with your organization and supporting your cause, and there's got to be at least one of those energetic, big picture thinking volunteers who might say, yes, this is something I want to work with you on. The other thing, and Isaiah mentioned this, is if you're concerned about your capacity, start with those advocacy activities that don't cost you anything. And there are lots of those. So for example, tweeting, sending emails, those are no-cost activities. And they're kind of a good way to get started in terms of increasing your capacity. And we're going to tell you more about some great tools and resources available to help you as we move forward. And so I think, before I turn it over, I think I just want to say that when we think about all the volunteers in particular that work at our organizations, imagine if we could just take a small portion of all that energy and direct it to also working on advocacy activities. What kind of a change could we make?
Great. Thanks, Minerva. Isaiah, I know that everybody wants to know what you can and can't do with your 501c3 status. You want to walk us through this?
Sure. Can you go to the next slide? So, as we've talked about, already, advocacy is multi-layered, but I feel like, especially since we have C3s and some other tax-exempt organizations on the phone, I think it's first to kind of lay a foundation before we talk about the rules. We'll lay a foundation around, what it means to be a 501c3 and what it actually means to be a C4. There are different types of tax-exempt organizations, and C3s or C4s and unions and trade associations are all tax-exempt. 501c3 public charities are tax-exempt groups. There are over 1.2 million charities in the United States. A big part of the reason why is because contributions to our organizations are tax-deductible. And private foundations, which are another type of C3. They are not public charities like we are. They are private foundations because they're privately supported organizations. And since they're privately supported, they're held to some different rules. And one of those rules requires that they pay out or they make grants yearly. And so we have a huge fundraising advantage because private foundations prefer to make those grants to other C3s, to public charities. So we have a huge fundraising advantage in our advantage in our tax treatment. And with those advantages comes some limitations. The first is on our lobbying, as I've talked about a little bit today. We're limited in the amount of lobbying that we can do. Those limitations, to be honest with you, are actually quite generous, and we can talk about that in the Q&A section, what those limits are. And then there's an absolute prohibition on supporting or opposing candidates as a C3. That's an absolute prohibition. While we can do many nonpartisan activities, and if you have questions about that, we can talk, we cannot support or oppose a candidate for office. The second column, I've got C4s. I don't know how many groups on the phone are with, you know, C4s or perhaps other tax-exempt groups. These organizations are unlimited in the amount of lobbying. They're tax-exempt. Contributions are not tax-deductible to these organizations. And they have a little bit more of a little bit tougher time raising money, but they can lobby to an unlimited extent and support or oppose candidates as a secondary activity. Next slide. All right, so there are two ways, and I'm going to kind of speed through this a little bit because of our time limitations. There are two ways, as I said, the lobbying for C3s is limited. There are two ways that you can measure that lobbying. The first is the default test, the default measurement, which comes directly from the definition of a C3, that no substantial part of your organization's activities will be to engage in legislative propaganda. The problem with the insubstantial part measurement or part test or no substantial part test is that there's no real definition of insubstantial, so it kind of leaves groups out there not knowing whether they're doing too much lobbying or not. And you report that the lobbying activities on your Form 990 Schedule C Part 2B. And so there's kind of a issue there with knowing whether or not you're doing too much lobbying. So we recommend organizations that they look into the 501H expenditure test. You make a one-time election, you send in a Form 5768 to the IRS, and you get concrete dollar-based limits and definitions of lobbying, and it's just a lot more simpler. It's a simpler way to measure your lobbying and to calculate how much lobbying you're actually doing as an organization. Next slide. And so here is the definitions of lobbying. We talked about grassroots lobbying earlier, so I won't really go into that right now, but direct lobbying is a communication to a legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation, legislators or staff, and this is on the federal, state, or local level. You should be calculating your time and your expenditures on any lobbying or anything you do that goes to communicate with a legislator expressing a view about specific legislation. And then you see the grassroots definition under that, and we talked about that earlier. And if we have more questions, we can get to it later. Thank you.
Yeah, I got some good questions, I think, queued up for our conversation. Meredith, do you want to inspire us here with a story of something that's really worked in your experience?
Great. And let me say from the start, because I work with a network of volunteers, many of, almost all of whom started off doing advocacy. It's not like we're born knowing who our members of Congress are or how to effectively do this. So thank you, everyone, for plugging into this webinar to learn more about that. And one other thing I want to remind you all as you're kind of thinking about this, and for those who might be thinking, might feel a little nervous about what they can do as a part of their organization, I just want to remind you that you as an individual can often engage, can engage in your own advocacy efforts beyond what you can do wearing your organization's hat. And I see that a lot there are a lot of folks who, because they might not feel comfortable doing it and as a part of their day job or as a part of they get involved with their local results chapter for that reason. So let me close out with a story, and some of you might have seen this on the Volunteer Match blog. So I have a friend named Lene Haven. So I got to meet Lene a couple of years ago back in 2013. So Lene is a low-income single mom. She's got a son named Connor, and Connor has a health condition that means access to quality nutrition is incredibly important to him. It means he might, the difference between showing up in the ER of his local hospital or not. And Lene, as a low-income single mom trying to make ends meet, she knew firsthand how important SNAP, the food stamp program, is for Connor and for her family. So Lene first got involved, heard about results and started building her advocacy skills in Albuquerque with our local volunteer chapter there, and then she was able to come to Washington, D.C. as a part of our conference 2 summers ago, and she shared directly with her members of Congress her story about Connor. And as she did that, her members of Congress were so moved that one of them, Representative Michelle Lujan Grisham, actually asked if she could use Lene's story and the picture of Connor as she went to the House floor to speak out against cuts to SNAP, the food stamp program. Congress at that point was considering about $40 billion in cuts to food stamp assistance. And Representative Michelle Lujan Grisham knew that story was the most powerful way she could make the case. So literally, Lene talks about, I started off with not knowing what the congressional record was to being in it. And you can see here in the slide, there's a link to where you can see her representative on C-SPAN talking about Lene. So I just wanted to use that as a story, again, because it reminds us how important it is to tell stories and make these issues real, and you all are in a tremendous place to do that. And also the folks who work within your community have a lot of power too. So as we close out, I just want to flag for folks that before we go to Q&A, that the Census Bureau did release their annual poverty data today, and you can see in this visual, I was able to pull this in, that there's some really critical programs that are making a big difference. Using the supplemental poverty measure, the Census Bureau found that programs like SNAP reduced the number of Americans in poverty, if that was calculated into the poverty rate, by 1.5%. And refundable tax credits, just like the EITC and the child tax credit for low-income working families, reduced the poverty rate by 3%, and Social Security over 8%. So policies do make a difference.
Great, thank you. All right. So I know you guys all have some amazing resources out there, and for everyone on the call, this is being recorded, and you will have access to these slides afterwards, so don't worry about having to try to write these all down as we go through. But Isaiah, you mentioned Bolder Advocacy. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the work that initiative does and some of those resources that are available for people getting started or looking to expand their advocacy programs?
Sure, I can do that. So I would recommend that anyone who has any kind of question about the legal rules that can impact your advocacy as a 501c3 public charity, I would encourage you to go to our website, bolderadvocacy.org, and we have tons of resources, fact sheets, and publications that are free for you to download, blog posts about advocacy or election-related activity. Our whole goal is to get organizations more comfortable with being advocates, with lobbying, with civic engagement. And then we also have tools. Minerva mentioned one of our tools earlier today. It's our advocacy capacity tool. I highly recommend it. It's free for download. Just use Bolder Advocacy /ACT, ACT, and that tool is all about helping you as an organization kind of find your strengths, your weaknesses, compare you to other organizations. The results aren't released, or your name isn't released, and you can really kind of figure out, what you need to do as an organization to be a stronger advocate, to be a better advocacy organization. And then finally, we also offer free technical assistance. So you can call us. I'm in our DC office. You can call or email us with your questions, and either me or one of my colleagues will be able to help walk you through any questions that are related to the legal rules that impact advocacy, nonprofit tax law, or federal election law. We cover that. And our assistance is free. Now, we can't represent you, but we can help to guide you, right? We can help guide you. So feel free to call me at 202-822-6070. If you're in Texas or on the West Coast, we have offices there too. And you can also email me. My email is Isaiah, that's ISAIAH, @afj.org. And you can reach me there anytime during the week. All right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And we can probably put that up. I think you have that on your first slide as well if people want to contact you. Again, this is being recorded, so you guys will have access to that information. All right. Minerva, you want to talk a little bit about the great playbook that you guys have put together?
Yes, thank you so much. And I just want to amplify something Isaiah said earlier, which is that, while there are some limits to lobbying in particular, that they are still very generous under our nonprofit status. And, most organizations don't come anywhere near reaching those limits. So it's important to know what the limits are, but, we're going to encourage you to do as much as you can within those legal limits. So the Alliance to End Hunger has put out this advocacy playbook, and what it is a toolkit, and you can find it here at alliancetoendhunger.org /advocacy-playbook, and it's a toolkit that will help facilitate advocacy. It's really focused on getting direct service organizations and their volunteers to get involved in advocacy against hunger. And it's an online interactive resource with step-by-step guidance on about 30 different advocacy activities, from the most basic to more complex. So no matter where your organization is in terms of its capacity, you can use the advocacy playbook. And there are lots of resources embedded in it, including links to results and other organizations that are working as partners in this endeavor around ending hunger and poverty. So I will not go to my next slide because I don't want to take too much time. I think I've said everything I wanted to say about the playbook. I encourage you to go online and check it out. And my contact information, in addition to, I think where we mentioned it before, my contact information is also all over this page on our website. So I would encourage you to go there at alliancetoendhunger.org. Thank you.
Great. And then Meredith, you want to walk us through the toolkits and resources that you have as well?
Yeah, so we have an activist toolkit that's pretty similar to the Alliance's. It's kind of a clickable piece, and you can see the link there and other actions you can take. One other piece I wanted to specifically highlight is in the Take Action section of our website. You can see under elected officials, you can look up, we have a tool where you can look up specific members of Congress. You plug in your zip code if you're not sure who they are. And then once you're there, you can see all the different tabs in this screenshot. You can look up the names of some of their key staff members. This is kind of based on the issues we focus on in terms of poverty, both U.S. and international poverty. You can see what committee assignments they have, how they voted on some key legislation, what legislation they've co-sponsored, in addition to how to contact them. So that's one other tool I just wanted to make sure I mentioned before we went to Q&A.
Great. Thank you. We've got some really good questions. I've got a couple of logistical questions that I want to get out of the way before we jump into the good conversation. Meredith or Minerva, there was a question about when that survey about influence with legislative staff was done. How old is that information?
2011.
2011. Okay, great. And then we just had a quick clarification, and I remember, Isaiah, you had that great chart up, but can you talk a little bit about what kinds of grassroots lobbying kind of work a 501c4 can do? Are there limits on that?
Thanks. So a 501c4, as we talked about, you know, how a 501c4 can lobby to an unlimited extent. There's no limitation on a C4's lobbying. So a C4 can engage in unlimited grassroots and direct lobbying.
That's what I thought, but I just wanted to hear it from our lawyer rather than making that assumption on my own.
Okay.
I'm going to keep going. Isaiah, one of the things that you talked about was that there are, you know, the sort of undefined nature of what is too much lobbying, what's insubstantial amounts of lobbying. Having spent most of my career in the not-for-profit 501c3 world, I know that many of our organization leaders can feel uncomfortable with sort of that undefined nature. What's some advice you might give or some recommendations you might make about finding that comfort level and how much lobbying is the right amount of lobbying for your organization?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So the thing is, there are two ways to measure your lobbying. That insubstantial part test, that no substantial measurement, is the default way to do it. That's the vague, nebulous standard that's based on your lobbying activity, and that's the one that's harder to manage as a C3, and that's why we encourage groups to make the 501H election, because that's more concrete. And you do that by doing Form 5768, and if you send that form into the IRS, it's one page, it's a simple form. Essentially, you are given lobbying limits, concrete dollar-based limits and definitions of lobbying based on your budget or your annual expenditures. So for an organization that spends $500,000 or less in a fiscal year in your annual expenditures, you can spend 20% of your budget of those expenditures on lobbying. And as your expenditures increase, your lobbying limit will decrease. So groups with over $17 million in annual expenditures are capped at $1 million in lobbying expenditures. Now, for most of our organizations, those are very generous lobbying limits, and it allows us to do a lot more, and it's concrete. So I would encourage you, if you're worried about the vague nature of that insubstantial activities-based test, I'd encourage you to look into the 501H election. We have a lot of, you know, we have plenty of resources on our website about the 501H election. You can call us anytime and we can talk through it. And if you're unsure about it and you're still under the insubstantial part test, it's just important that you track any activity that you do that will impact or try to impact the passage of legislation. And that you report that activity. Great,
thank you. For Meredith or Minerva, whoever this sort of jumps out to the most, or maybe both of you have some thoughts on this, as a person who tries to mobilize volunteers on a daily basis, sometimes, you know, Meredith, you'd mentioned that emails, individualized emails now carry as much weight with staffers as letters do, handwritten or typed out letters. But a lot of times taking those actions online or sending that email doesn't feel super impactful. And in an era where we talk about slacktivism, you know, how do we make sure that our volunteers understand the real impact of the work that something that feels as insubstantial as sending an email can have?
Yeah, well, you know, and it is interesting when you're welcome to scroll back to that visual. There is a huge difference between a personalized email and a form email. So, one very basic thing that doesn't take a lot of time is to just tailor that email to, and you could do it in about 90 seconds to insert specific information about why you care about an issue, about the needs in your community, etc. It takes it from something that about 1 in 5 staff says has a lot of positive influence rather than just 1% of staff saying it has a lot of influence. So that's just, I want to first kind of underscore that. But, I do think looking for those ways to engage at a deeper level, it is a heavier lift, but it has tremendous payback, because you can see, when policymakers are hearing directly from their constituents in in-person visits, or they're getting information where somebody is representing other constituents, that it does have a lot of influence over the process. That being said, I very much get that there's such an immediate gratification when you're interacting with folks in your community. You're directly in person, often seeing the needs and knowing that you're making a difference to address those needs. And I don't want to underscore that. And one of the reasons I want to emphasize that, and at the same time, that's one of the reasons we're actually Results uses a kind of a chapter model, because that kind of sense of coming together with 4, 5, 6 other folks in your community, planning a meeting with a policymaker, who's going to say what, researching, their stances and what, preparing for that, you do have that same kind of sense of, being connected and not just being kind of I'm going to just click and send something, and it can have a big impact. So I wanted to, I think kind of banding with others makes it feel like it both has a bigger impact and makes it feel like you're not just kind of out there on your own. Minerva, do you want to add to that?
I think you gave a great answer, and the only thing I would add is, if your folks are feeling like we're not doing enough, that's a good problem to have, right? So, so dig a little deeper. I would refer you to either Results materials or the Advocacy Playbook to try to find some new and different activities that you can work together as a group.
Great. Yeah, it's always a good problem to have when you have motivated volunteers and need a place to deploy them into the community. Following up on that question, Minerva, one of the first things that you said is that advocacy works. And both in sort of the volunteer engagement field as well as in some of our organizations where advocacy or storytelling is not something we're very, very good at, what are some of those ideas that you might have or recommendations any of you might make about finding those stories and telling those stories in a way to make a case for how advocacy can work in our organizations?
It's a great question. I think I would challenge everyone to maybe understand that those stories are much closer than we think they are. We can usually find those stories speaking to our program participants or sometimes our volunteers, sometimes staff members, or engaging with our communities. So the stories are out there. I think, it's not necessarily a natural thing to, sort of share those stories with each other. I think it's about creating a safe space, creating that trust where people can feel comfortable about coming together. There's certainly lots of mechanisms to share the stories, and in the Advocacy Playbook you will find a section on telling your story using a StoryCorps app. So the mechanism is there, but it's about really building the trust, and starting at the beginning, saying hello to people, sitting down with them, getting to know them, and building a relationship many times before they're willing to share their story with either you or, a more public setting. Does that help?
And, this is Meredith. Just to chime in, we've developed some tools that generally also just to kind of train ourselves to speak effectively in kind of your advocacy elevator pitch. So we do a lot of trainings both from a staff level but also our local volunteers do and how to make your case in a clear, powerful kind of elevator pitch. And happy to share more information about that. We call it a laser talk, and then a deeper way of telling stories if you've got an opportunity, for instance, in a sit-down meeting with a policymaker. You know, the stories about how advocacy itself can make a difference. We actually, every month we do a webinar with our network of volunteers across the country, and one of the things we do is have folks tell their advocacy, a couple different advocacy stories each month so they can learn from each other, but also just to remind ourselves that the different, you know, you're doing something and maybe you feel like you're not doing, you know, getting very far with a certain member of Congress, but it's great to hear how maybe your work combines with other work. If somebody's had kind of a breakthrough moment with their own member of Congress, you know, for example, this past Saturday, one of our volunteers in Utah shared about in 1 week she had an opportunity to sit down with to in-person engage with one of her senators, and then also have a very important meeting about 45 minutes long with the key aide who handles tax policy for the other senator, and she had 3 letters to the editor published in local papers. So when you hear about that and you hear that, you know, from these policymakers, oh, we're really, you know, this is an issue that we're well aware of because we're hearing a lot from the community. It doesn't always happen all like that in 1 week, but it's good to share advocacy stories with each other and learn from each other.
Great. Thank you. Minerva, wanted to let you know that we had a shout out from Melissa that the Advocacy Playbook is awesome. She had a chance to see this through the AmeriCorps Vista training in Iowa. So a lot of recognition out there for the great work that all of you are doing, helping all of us play a better role in the advocacy work we're doing in our communities. All right, we're just at the top of the hour. Any last final words from our panelists? Anything you want to make sure you get out there before we end today?
If I don't, this is Minerva, I'll go first. I think just, you know, first of all, thank you all for listening in. And it sounds as if many of you are already doing advocacy and are looking to step up your game. Please just know that we're here for you as resources, you know, and you know, there are lots of ways we'd like to encourage you. So please reach out.
Great, Meredith, Isaiah.
Yeah, this is Meredith. The one thing I will say is specifically as it relates to issues of poverty, tomorrow is literally the day most likely in the entire year that this evening's news and tomorrow's newspapers, the poverty might be on the front page of your local paper because the Census Bureau has just released this poverty data. So this is a particularly ripe moment to get engaged in the process, again, directly with policymakers, but also, you know, share your expertise by submitting something to the local newspaper or something like that. So again, this is kind of a particularly ripe moment to think about jumping in for those who are working to address poverty in your communities.
Great. Isaiah?
And yeah, I would just say, you know, in closing, if you need assistance, if you want to get involved, you know, we encourage organizations, and I think we talked about it today, to be involved in advocacy because you have a very unique relationship with your community. There are no other organizations, whether it's corporate America, you know, on the for-profit side, no one can have, or politicians, no one has the same connection that you do as a nonprofit, or especially as a direct service nonprofit. So it's important to engage in advocacy, to do it. You can do it legally, you can do it safely, and if you need any help with that, feel free to go to our website or give us a call. And we're always available to help you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Volunteer Match has some resources as well, including our great blog that Meredith wrote something for earlier this week. You're also welcome to contact me. Again, the recording and the slides will be sent out to you a little bit later today, and will be posted on our Insights YouTube channel, so you can find it there as well. Thank you again to all of our panelists. Great work, super inspirational work, and it's nice to know that we can work within that lobbying, grassroots lobbying framework for 501c3s and still make a difference in the community without jeopardizing our tax status. Thanks, everybody. We hope to see you on a future webinar. Bye-bye.